Africans confused modernization with the necessity to have European culture. Because, again, as I pointed out, of the complicity of Africans, some of them in the slave trade, leading some Africans who had been enslaved to lose confidence in their own traditional culture. Some had become estranged from their culture due to their experience in the Caribbean, Sierra Leone. So had Africans not faced imperialism, the slave trade, colonialism, then they would have had a different route. But we got to understand we didn't, but we need to understand the other route. And that was the route pursued by Japan. Japan became the first nation of color to industrialize, but they industrialized without taking on European culture. They came out of a feudal system that had been samurai warrior-based, and they could see that the Europeans had armed themselves. They had set up great ships. They had set up great navies. They had set up great military systems, and these were based on industrial power, technology, gunpowder, cannon, machine guns, and so forth. They saw that. And so they sent their brightest to Europe to train to get the technology. That's much of what China's done under Deng Xiaoping. They've modernized. But again, they didn't have years of colonialism. They didn't have years of enslavement. China had semi-colonialism, colonialism on its borders, but it did not go inside the interior and take over. China maintained intact their own leadership, at war with each other during a civil war period, during and before World War II, but Chinese leadership. And so the best path for Africa would have been that, and it would have happened, but for this intervention. So it's going to take Africa longer because of this intervention for it to see that culture, European culture, needs to be separated from modernization, and modernization needs to be in a new form, not industrialization, which people didn't understand at the time that it occurred was destructive to the planet. And so now solar and wind power are the way to go, as opposed to destroying the atmosphere through industrial power. So it will take longer for Africa to be able to draw from the best of its own system while using the technology that is needed, that is not harmful to the environment. And this is why, because of this intervention. So this is where Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden's insights into the value of African life and customs is invaluable for Africa today and tomorrow, and African people worldwide, and anyone that really wants to gain freedom, because it ain't just Africans that are imprisoned under a Western system. So Blyden's appeal in the 19th century did take root among a small group of African-trained Christians who came to oppose and resent this idea that Europeans were their tutors, the Europeans were their teachers, the Europeans assumed that Africans were children. They resented that. And so they found in Blyden their leader that opposed the missionary project. And they saw the need to draw from this African model, but they were a minority. Blyden could lead this movement to base African governments on African life and customs, which is the title of his book. He could lead this movement first because he was proud to be Black and to be African. But he could lead this movement because he underwent an experience that enabled him to appreciate traditional African life and customs. And at the same time, I would add, to some degree, he saw the need for modernization. There are ideas that I'll offer on that as well. What happens with Blyden is he holds these offices as, ambassador to England and university professor and whatnot. But when he's out of office, he gets hired as an agent for the interior in Freetown. Freetown is one of the cities in Liberia. And it was this experience that allowed him to go into the interior and live with everyday traditional people. And he got to observe the African life and customs, the title of this book, and could see its value because he already had a mind that was African oriented. But he could now see how African societies were organized. And in the 19th century, this knowledge didn't exist. And some of his conclusions on why traditional African culture operated the way it did are still quite original today. So what did he see? First of all, many African scholars make the mistake of judging Blyden based on his most famous work, which is called Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. And so I know from talking to a lot of our scholars that they find fault with Blyden because Blyden seemed to be saying in this book that he favored Islam over Christianity. Now, these Africans weren't opposing Blyden because they thought he should favor Christianity. They didn't favor either one. But the fact that he was favoring Islam was a problem for them. But the reason that they got this problem is they haven't read African Life and Customs. And had they read it, they would have had a better appreciation of what Blyden really was committed to. Blyden loved African culture above all else. Whether it was a African who was a Christian who appreciated the culture, or an African who was a Muslim that did. For him, what was primary was African culture. But when Blyden makes the observation in Christianity, Islam, and the Negro of favoring Islam over Christianity among Africans, what he's doing actually is saying that he favors the Africanized Islamic Africans over the brainwashed, white-itis, Europeanized African Christians. That's what he's saying. And this is similar to the observations that Dr. Jeffries made about the Murid, the people of Senegal, who Africanized Islam to the point that they had their own holy city. It can suffice to go there as opposed to Mecca, though many in Senegal would like to do both. This was an Africanized Muslim, and Islam had to submit to African culture. This is what Blyden saw. And so it was the independence mind of the Africans who embraced Islam that he embraced. And this, he was in the interior during a time of upheaval where there were Islamic movements. These were Black movements against corruption. And you had leaders like Don Fadayo, who led insurrection against, corruption among traditional Africans and among Muslims. And he was not a warrior, but his people called on him to lead jihads, holy wars against corruption. So he saw that, and that's what he identified with. It wasn't so much Islam. It was the fact that the people, the Africans who were practicing this, thought for themselves because Islam had been converted to an African framework. And this is true all over West Africa. The Bambara, Malcolm's great ancestor, Ajar, was probably Bambara. The Bambara masters are traditionalists, and they follow the same system of initiation as the Dogon, and near the same area, the Bangandiria Cliffs. But when they pray, they call Allah. But everything that gets them to that point is African. And this is what he was observing. This is not to support Islam or oppose it. I'm simply saying that's where he was coming from. And you saw with Diop had his own mindset. It was spirit-based. He reached conclusions directly based on intuition and mostly was right. That's coming out of an African framework, as opposed to thinking the way Descartes did, step by step. You know what I mean? There's a step by step to common sense, you know? So what Blyden was particularly critical of the missionaries for was substituting mental slavery for physical slavery. These are Blyden's words. Other critics of the missionary enterprise criticized the way the missionary enterprise worked on Africans, and I've noted the same observation made by Native Americans on how when their people were brainwashed under the Christian enterprise, they both reached the same conclusion, that the people coming out were useless to them. Native Americans said they couldn't run or hunt or fight. The Africans said they couldn't plant a crop, you know. They couldn't do any work. They were good at sitting behind a desk and pushing a pencil or a pen if they got one. That was what education meant for them. So this is what Blyden had contempt for. So when Ezekwe said that very few of Blyden's contemporaries appreciated his visionary gospel, he was referring to those Africans who suffered from mental slavery, mental incarceration, who were then in, though they didn't have it then, and now are in need of the sixfold stages to mental freedom. And I'm telling you, that's an experience. That's a transformation. The reason that a Nyerere was any good is that he was tradition bound. And so he could see things through the eyes of African traditionalists. The reason that I have behind me on this side, Amilcar Cabral, is he had been an assimilated African that underwent transformation. That was the same thing with Theophilo Benga and the same thing with me. And that requires a transformational process. That was a problem for Nkrumah. That was a problem. He had been too Western educated. He knew a lot about African culture, but too Western educated. And it affects your style of leadership. It even affects your vision, even though he was one of our greatest visionaries.